So, you think real estate is expensive today? Try buying a house in ancient Rome. You had skyrocketing land prices, crushing debt, corrupt landlords, and a rigged economy. You could almost use those same words to describe our current market. Well, Rome paved the way for those practices. By the height of the Roman Empire, around 100-ish AD, about 1% of the population controlled nearly all of the land in Rome, while millions of people lived in overpriced, crumbling, fire-prone apartments. So how did the Roman elite manipulate land prices, drive small landowners into debt, and turn the economy into a glorified Ponzi scheme? And how did this help lead to the overall collapse of the ancient Roman Empire? Today, we're going to dive deep into one of the craziest real estate markets in history, if you can even call it that. Welcome back to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more videos like this. Before we get into the scandals, corruption, and political assassinations, let's break down the different types of real estate we had in ancient Rome. To start, there were two major categories of property. You had the urban real estate, which you had the domus and insula. The domus was the Roman equivalent of a mansion, a massive, luxurious home in prime locations like the Palatine Hill in Rome. A domus could cost anywhere from 500,000 to 10 million sesterces, depending on its location. For reference, it's hard to estimate exactly how much a sesterce would be worth today, but some sources guess around half of a US dollar, so we'll go with that. Only wealthy aristocrats, senators, and merchants could afford one of these. Some of the most famous domus properties included Cicero's house on the Palatine, which was estimated about 3.5 million sesterces, and Sulla's daughter's villa, which was about 10 million sesterces. Now, for the other 90% of Romans, they lived in the insula. Insulae were the Roman equivalent of slums. Overcrowded, flammable apartments, blocks built as high as 6 or even 7 stories. Rent was 2 to 3 denarii per day for a tiny room, about the same as a daily wage for a laborer. Many insulae collapsed due to poor construction, and fires were an everyday hazard. If you were poor, you weren't just a renter, you were at the mercy of your landlord. The other type of real estate ancient Rome has was your rural real estate. You had farms, villas, and latifundia. In early Rome, small farmers owned 5 jugera, which was 1¼ hectares, which is about enough to support a family. As Rome conquered new territories, land was supposed to be redistributed to soldiers. But instead, wealthy elites took control of huge estates, forming latifundia, massive slave-run plantations. A single latifundium could be thousands of hectares, worked by hundreds or even thousands of slaves. Poor farmers who couldn't compete were forced to sell their land and move to the cities, which led to Rome's growing underclass of unemployed, landless citizens. The last type of land you had was the ager publicus, the stolen public land. Rome claimed conquered land as public land, ager publicus. In theory, this land was for all the Romans, but in practice, it was grabbed up by the small elite. This set up centuries of land disputes, corruption, and violent uprisings. Now that we know how real estate worked, let's look at how the system got completely hijacked by Rome's wealthiest families. Believe it or not, there was a time when owning land in Rome was easy. In the earliest days of the Republic, around 500 BC, land was handed out almost for free to its citizens. But of course, there was always a catch. In Rome, land was more than just property. It was a requirement for citizenship and even military service. If you didn't own land, you weren't considered a full citizen. If you didn't own land, you couldn't join the army. This system tied military duty to land ownership, which meant that Rome's early army wasn't a professional force. It was actually a militia of farmers. And this wasn't a bad deal at first. After all, you fought for Rome, you were rewarded with land won in the conquest. But that's when the problems started. In theory, every Roman soldier was supposed to receive a small farm, usually around 5 jugera, again 1¼ hectares, just enough land to support a small family. But as Rome expanded, the reality didn't quite match the promise. First, the good things. Early conquests meant that Rome had tons of land to give away. If you had fought in a war, you could expect a piece of farmland in return. The bad. Not all land was equal. Some plots were fertile and valuable, others were rocky, barren, or prone to flooding. The ugly. As the republic grew, wealthier senators and patricians began manipulating the system to grab huge estates, pushing small farmers off of their land. One of the earliest examples of this was the Patrician land grab of 486 BC, which led to the first major land reform fight, but we'll get to that in the next section. For now, let's look at how the small farming system actually worked. For an ordinary Roman, owning a 5-jugera farm wasn't about getting rich. It was simply about survival. A small farm had to provide enough wheat to make bread for your family, a few olive trees for oil, a vineyard for wine, because even the poorest Romans drank wine, and maybe even some goats or pigs for milk and meat. But here's the problem. Farming wasn't easy. It was actually pretty hard. Droughts, bad weather, or pests could wipe out an entire harvest. Farmers had to sell their excess crops to afford tools, taxes, and goods they couldn't make themselves. If they had a bad year, they had to take out loans. And if they couldn't pay them back, well, they lost their land, and this is where the real crisis began. The rich knew that land was the key to power, so they started rigging the system to push small landowners into debt and dependence. So at first, the land system actually seemed pretty fair, but as early as 450 BC, the elite began manipulating the rules to keep land in their own hands. Here's about how they did it. Number 1, debt traps. Wealthy landowners loaned money to struggling farmers at extremely high interest rates. When the farmers couldn't pay, they had to sell their land back to the lender. 2, fake auctions. The Senate rigged land auctions to ensure that only the rich could afford to buy them. If a piece of public land was put up for sale, a poor farmer couldn't afford the bidding war. 3, Senate corruption. Senators, who themselves were landowners, ignored laws meant to limit land ownership and passed new ones to protect their estates. 4, slave labor undercut the farmers. The rich bought slaves to work their land, making them more profitable than small family farms. This drove independent farmers out of business. By the time of about 400 BC, an average Roman farmer wasn't just competing with his wealthy neighbors. He was competing with entire estates run by slaves. And when farmers lost their land, they had only one place to go, the city slums of Rome. This led to a growing crisis where more and more land ended up in the hands of the elite. The number of landless, jobless citizens in Rome exploded. Rome became increasingly reliant on war and conquest to keep giving land to new soldiers. And this was just the beginning. The next major land crisis would explode in 486 BC when Rome's first attempt at land reform led to violence, corruption, and even assassination. By the early 5th century BC, Rome had already conquered huge amounts of land. But instead of being fairly distributed among soldiers and citizens, the land was stolen by the wealthy elite. The first major fight over land erupted in about 486 BC, when a Roman leader named Spurius Cassius proposed the first ever land reform law. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, let's just say the rich didn't take it well. Because of Cassius, ended up dead, and the elite made sure nobody would ever talk about his ideas again. So what exactly happened, and how did this scandal shape centuries of corruption and land theft in ancient Rome? Let's break it down. Spurius Cassius wasn't just some random politician. He was a war hero, a 3-time consul, and one of the first men to see the land crisis coming. Cassius had already proven himself in battle, helping Rome defeat the Volsci, Herensii, and Aqui, 3 powerful rival tribes. Thanks to his victories, Rome took control of huge swaths of new territory. So naturally he asked, hey, we just won a bunch of land. Shouldn't we use it to help actual Romans instead of just making the rich richer? Big mistake. The Senate wasn't interested in fairness. They were only interested in power. And that's when things got ugly. In 486 BC, Cassius proposed Rome's first ever agrarian law, which would redistribute conquered land fairly among the poor and soldiers, prevent patricians, which are elite families, from illegally occupying public land, ager publicus, give half the newly conquered Herensii land back to the Herensii people. It was a bold move, and one that terrified the Roman Senate. Why? Because the Senate was full of landowners who already grabbed the best public land for themselves. If Cassius succeeded, they would lose wealth, power, and influence. So instead of debating the law, the patricians launched a smear campaign against him. The elites couldn't outright reject the agrarian law. It was too popular. Instead, they did what politicians do best. They changed the conversation. The Senate accused Cassius of trying to make himself king, Rome's worst crime since they had just overthrown their last king in 509 BC, bribing the poor by offering land, threatening Rome's stability by weakening the aristocracy, and just like that, a good law became a political scandal that people were divided. Some supported Cassius, but others started turning against him. The Patricians then used the oldest trick in the book. They stalled the vote. For months, the Senate dragged out the debate, hoping people would forget about the law. But Cassius didn't give up. He kept pushing, so the Senate decided to get rid of him. In a sham trial, Spurius Cassius was accused of treason. His crime? Trying to help the poor. The Senate convicted him without evidence. He was publicly executed. His house was burned to the ground, a brutal move meant to erase his memory from history. And just like that, Rome's first major land reformer was gone. The agrarian law killed with him, and the result, the rich kept all the land, while the poor got nothing. But the elites weren't satisfied with just killing Cassius. They wanted to make sure nobody ever challenged them again. The death of Spurius Cassius set the stage for a century of land corruption. The rich became untouchable. The Senate learned that if they killed reformers, they could keep stealing land. Public land became private estates. Wealthy patricians ignored laws and took over Rome's best farmland for themselves. Debt started crushing small farmers. The poor had no choice but to borrow money. But when they couldn't repay, they lost their land and were forced into the overcrowded slums of Rome. And if you think this sounds bad, just wait, it gets much worse. Over the next 300 years, Rome's land crisis would lead to the rise of slavery on plantations, latifundia, massive wealth inequality, the assassination of more reformers like the Gracchi brothers in 133 BC, we'll get to that later, and eventually the collapse of the Republic itself. Spurius Cassius was the first land reformer to die for his cause, but he wouldn't be the last.